Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar Regulation in the Times of Pandemic and Lessons for the Future, a European View. This is the second joint event organised by BEREC and the IIC, which follows on from last year's successful 10th anniversary conference for BEREC that we jointly organised in Riga. I'm told that we have 480 people registered for the event, and I hope that everybody is keeping well, and or at least as well as you can in the circumstances. My name is Jeremy Godfrey. I am a Vice Chair of BEREC for this year, and I am a Commissioner in ComReg, the Irish Telecommunications Regulator. I'd like to start with a word of thanks to the staff of IIC and the staff in the BEREC office for all the technical support and organisation that's gone into the webinar. And also, of course, I must thank the speakers and everybody watching this afternoon. Let me start off by setting the scene and introducing this afternoon's speakers. I think it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that the telecoms sector and the telecommunications, electronic communications, has saved lives during the pandemic. It saved lives because it's made lockdowns and social distancing more tolerable from an economic perspective by enabling people to work from home, and from a social perspective by enabling school children to work, to learn from home, and enabling families to stay and friends to stay in contact through video conference dinners, cups of coffee, drinks, and so forth. And of course, this has led to a big surge in traffic, which we'll hear about. But the fears that maybe some people had at the beginning that networks might have trouble coping have proved largely unfounded. And that's really due to both to investment that happened before the crisis over many years, and a lot of hard work that people have put in during the crisis. So I think we all owe a big debt of thanks to the staff of the telecoms operators, to the engineers, the customer support staff, the field staff, the sales staff. They have made a big contribution to the pandemic response. And if it's not too immodest to say so, I think we should also acknowledge the role of regulators, regulatory affairs staff, policymakers, and so forth. Now, in Ireland, we, like our poets, a number of our poets have won Nobel Prizes, and one of them, a well-known poet, Seamus Heaney, was quoted in 1972. He said, "If we winter this one out, we can summer anywhere." And that's, I think, a message of hope that has been taken to heart by many people in Ireland as a way of expressing their feelings during the current situation. And so the panelists here today are really here to discuss how we're doing and how the telecoms industry has helped us to winter this one out, and what we think and what they think that the summer might bring, and what difference that might make to the way the role the telecoms industry plays, and the way that we support it and regulate it, and the wider digital sector. So to introduce the speakers, first we're going to hear from Dr. Roberto Viola, who I'm sure is very well known to almost everybody on the webinar. So Roberto is the Director General of DG Connect, which is the Directorate for Communications, Networks, Content and Technology at the European Commission. Roberto has a very long association with telecoms policymaking and regulation as Deputy Director General in DG Connect, but also previously as Chairman of the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, and as a member of the BEREC board before he joined the Commission. And in fact, Roberto was Chair of BEREC's predecessor, the European Regulators Group. After Roberto, we'll hear from this year's Chair of BEREC, Dan Sjöblom, who's also the Director General of the Swedish Post and Telecoms Authority. Prior to taking up his position with PTS, Dan was Director General of the Swedish Competition Authority for 8 years, and he's also a board member of the Swedish Broadband Council. And Dan worked in the European Commission on the competition side between 1996 and 2009. Then we will hear from Lindsay Fussell, who is the Group Director for Consumer and External Relations at Ofcom, the UK's regulatory authority for telecoms and media. Lindsay leads Ofcom's work on consumer policy and enforcement, and in her role as external relations, used to represent Ofcom on the BEREC Board of Regulators. Prior to joining Ofcom, Lindsay was Director of Public Services at the UK Treasury, where she led work on public spending on education, defence and criminal justice. Then we will hear from Dr. Antonio De Tomaso, who we know as Antonello. And Antonello is Director of EU and International Affairs at AGCOM, which is the national regulatory authority for electronic communications, media and postal services in Italy. And Antonello has a long-standing international experience. He's a member of many institutional bodies, has served on many projects in the field of electronic communications, media and ICT. And in BEREC, he's chaired several working groups. He's currently the co-chair of the Regulatory Framework Working Group, and he is the alternate member for AGCOM on the BEREC Board of Regulators. And finally, we will welcome Dr. Wilhelm Eschweiler from BNetzA. Wilhelm is the Vice President of the Federal Network Agency in Germany. He's one of two vice presidents, and he has responsibility for regulation of the telecommunications and rail sectors. Wilhelm was chair of BEREC in 2016, and prior to his current positions, he worked in several senior positions in the Federal Ministry of Economics and Energy. So I think we have a very experienced group of panelists from a range of different countries whose experiences of the pandemic has been different. And of course, Roberto can give us an overall European view. So I've asked each of the speakers really to give us a flavor of the situation in their respective spheres, the measures that have been taken during the pandemic, and their thoughts on what the future might hold. Roberto will shortly give an opening and keynote address, and we'll hear opening remarks from the other panelists. We'll have an open discussion to pick up on some of the points raised by the speakers, and there'll also be an opportunity for questions from participants. And we aim to finish at 17:15 Central European time. There's already been some questions submitted in advance this morning, which I will take the opportunity to put to the panel. But if you do have questions as you listen to the panelists, you can either tweet them on Twitter using the hashtag BEREC-Webinar, or you can send them by email to the press office at BEREC, which is press@berec.europa.eu. So with that, I will hand over to Roberto and ask him to give the opening keynote address. Please, Roberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. Perfect. So, dear Jeremy, dear Dan, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure to participate in this webinar, and let me thank the organizers, so IIC and BEREC, for taking this initiative. It's really, you said it, and I need to stress it, really unprecedented time for all of us, for this generation, the greatest challenge ever. And unfortunately, we are still in this challenge, but let me join to the thanks to all of those that are really working hard to keep us together, especially looking at the sector that we are discussing today, so the workers in the various sectors of the telecom industry, in connectivity, in IT platforms. This is really what keeps, in this case, the world together, and as you say, keeping the social distancing safe for life. But also the telemedicine, data handling in critical functions such as in hospitals. I mean, we have seen how important a well-connected society. Unfortunately, digital is not directly a cure remedy for all this, but it's a very important element to alleviate, and probably, why not, and I will touch on this, to find the solution how to get out of it. Now, of course, we do hope to get out quickly, although this quickly can be challenged, but this is the hope. At the same time, we know that the world after this crisis will be probably never like the world before this crisis. This crisis has triggered a permanent change of our society, has triggered an acceleration in terms of digitizing our society, our social interaction, the way we work, the way we learn, which has been impressive. Entire companies today are run in teleworking. That was unthinkable a few weeks ago. But companies also that have a very critical function in terms of real-time function, like telecom companies. Most of the telecom staff are at home. Still companies are running well. The same of companies that are operating on financial markets. Again, you need to have quite responsive real-time action. And although this requires a lot of interaction, it can be done from basically the various homes of the employee. So this means that we have to reflect profoundly on this change, which in a way it's unwanted, it's very unfortunate, very painful, but at the same time there's some good in it. And this is also the angle I like to keep in my speech. I mean, looking at the present and the complexities, but also looking at the future and the way we can improve. Now, if we see many of the things we have been discussing as a kind of very entertaining discussion in webinars before the crisis in conferences like this, like for instance our net neutrality rules. Now we have seen the real thing. So things like net neutrality, data sharing, use of mobility data. We have been discussing a lot about this. Now we see the real thing. Now, the first lesson we start to draw from all this is that the net neutrality framework in Europe has been, I would say, with a bit of practice, well designed and well managed by the regulators. Because it has shown in the case of the almost emergency, because it was an unthinkable load on our networks and need, to be connected, that the rules are in place to handle traffic prioritization when needed without any problem. So all the fears of the operators, or some of the market participants, that the net neutrality framework will be an impediment to innovation, to handle an emergency, I think in practice it should not be that important. And the framework is important. Imagine that one would have a doubt these days that applications have to be treated in the same way. Imagine one would have a doubt that there cannot be commercial consideration in slowing down use, but just public interest. So I think, first of all, big thank to all the sector. Second, big thank to the wisdom of the regulators in applying this framework in a good way. And thanks to Europe that we have clear rules which allow us to manage this crisis. We have been, and together with BEREC, doing quite an exercise in monitoring the traffic throughout the networks. Clearly, we have seen a shift from traffic that was originated from corporations, which are basically shifting at the homes of where people live. Overall, the networks are reacting positively to this impressive law, and especially the internet. But of course, in some cases, the quality is a bit going down. In this, it really had a commitment that the large media companies, especially large platforms, took with the permission of the Commissioner Breton to slow down a little bit the highest quality connections. And this has helped, and we have observed after the commitment, the drop of roughly 30% of traffic. It has helped the commitment of the European Union broadcasters to do the same in the streaming services. It has helped the orderly handling of the telecom. The other area where digital has been very much in the forefront is in trying to understand whether with the use of technology we can alert people that they've been in contact with people that are infected. Now, at the beginning of this discussion, whether there could be something useful, also looking at the experience in Korea, we called this as tracing apps, which created a lot of emotion in people, that we are kind of tracking people where they are. Now, I think after the work we have been doing with the member states, issuing a recommendation, then working on a common specifications with the member states for the toolbox, it's very clear that those apps will be based on Bluetooth technology, will be based on anonymous keys, will be based on an exchange of data which is absolutely protecting personal information, but no personal information will be exchanged between two phones, for instance, and will not use the positioning of the user. Of course, as every IT system, there might be weaknesses, but those weaknesses are absolutely minimized by very strong encryption of the information being transmitted, which is also minimized. Now, we are actually in the stage 2, which is to make sure that these apps can work in an interoperable way throughout Europe. Sort of roaming. We want to come back to a situation where we can cross borders very quickly, and this is a tool that helps in this respect. We are in discussion with the BEREC-IIC group. We have involved the BEREC-IIC group because at a certain moment, I'm sure also the help of regulators will be important in securing that the system works well. We have using as much as we can supercomputing in helping to find remedies in terms of antiviral remedies illnesses. In particular, I mean, we are trying to understand the structure of the virus and what kind of existing components can be actually effective. It's a gigantic effort that involves many labs around Europe, and it uses, I mean, the best of what we have, artificial intelligence and computing. So we hope to announce something that in terms of discovery in the next days. But even if this will not happen, you know, the work will take place. The exercise of getting all the pharma companies together, to get all the supercomputing platforms together, to get all the data scientists, the biologists together, was an immensely useful exercise to foster cooperation and to foster data sharing. We have been looking at disinformation, which has plagued this crisis, and trying to work with the code of practice with the platform, trying to remove disinformation. And allowed me to, in particular, speak about this incredible association between the virus spreading and 5G, which, I mean, even if you are not somebody that study the basic of physics, it looks really stupid, and it is stupid. The World Health Organization, the European Commission, have issued very clear statements about the stupidity of HSC. Unfortunately, some people got very excited and attacked some masks around Europe. We have actually worked well with the platform that removed the content was clearly fake content, which was actually made people, I mean, targeting people beliefs in a way which was not acceptable. And also there are many other disinformation campaigns about the virus that we are trying to take. Now, looking at the recovery as a final consideration, we need more investments in digital. That's clear. So this, as I said, it's a structural change, which we need to foster with more investment in digital communication infrastructure, in data infrastructure, and computing. it will make our society more resilient, it will make our society better. From the point of view of the regulation, we need to facilitate this investment. We need to make sure that we remove all red tape that would impede the rollout of new telecom infrastructure. We need to make sure that, we do not delay the release of 5G spectrum and find a good arrangements in terms of the sustainability of such investment by, for instance, network sharing. We need to make sure that, we have a future-proof regulation when it comes to the sharing of capacity of the next generation. So this is clearly a priority that we owe to our society, to our constituencies, to have a better, more resilient society in the future. Thank you very much for your
attention. Thank you, Roberto. I just picked up, that was a very useful and comprehensive keynote. I had a request on Twitter, I think, when you were talking about net neutrality, rather ironically, the connection at that point, some of the packets didn't get through, and I think some of the audience didn't hear that. But if I might summarize, and tell me if I'm summarizing wrongly, I think what Roberto had to say about net neutrality was that really, at a time when the possibility of congestion was really tested by COVID, the net neutrality regulation really stood the test of time, that it didn't, the networks coped well, there was no need to prioritize traffic in order to make things work, and that the openness and the equality of traffic, the rights of end users to access this content they needed had absolutely been upheld, even in the most difficult times. But Roberto,
yes, but operators can prioritize that in case of emergency. This is not forbidden at all. Yeah. This is part of the net neutrality regulation. So to those operators that have written to us, we have clarified. BEREC and the Commission issued a statement which clarifies this. So there's nothing wrong in guaranteeing that everybody gets the service and, if necessary, to prioritize the service. What, of course, is not part of the decision-making is commercial consideration, but this is not the case that we described. So it's okay.
Okay, thank you, Roberto, for clarifying that. If I may now give the floor to Dan to give both to talk from the BEREC perspective, but also I think it'd be interesting to hear about the Swedish perspective as well, where the government policies on pandemic response have been a little bit different than in other places, and also, of course, Sweden has a very high fibre rollout, so it'd be interesting to hear what extent that made. So, Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thanks, Roberto, for opening the session. I will speak, I think, mostly with my BEREC chair hat on. I will say a few things about Sweden. I might start with debunking a little bit the myth that we have no lockdown restrictions or anything in Sweden. In fact, myself and most of the team at PTS have been working from home. We are now in the 9th week of doing that. Our schools are closed for the same period of time for higher education, and there are severe restrictions. We haven't met my father-in-law, for example, for the same period. You cannot visit older people. So there are many things that are happening here as well. But okay, we have had less of a complete lockdown than many other societies. Perhaps, and we will see, I suppose, in a number of years or months what effects are over time. Now, as BEREC, what has BEREC been doing during the pandemic? Roberto mentioned some of the more important work that we've been doing. So on the 19th of March this year, there was a joint statement between BEREC and the European Commission on how network operators can cope with increased demand of network capacity. And we set up a special reporting mechanism to ensure that there were no capacity or congestion issues that went on for a long time, and the reporting obligations and reporting continuously to the NRAs. So we collected that information on a weekly or twice weekly basis to start with the help of the sector, obviously. The obvious reason was to ensure that if there were congestion issues, we would find out quickly and we would be able to deal with it so that we could assist in keeping Europeans connected during this very difficult time. And we very quickly started also to publish these weekly reports. So we wanted to have transparency on this issue. So every week there is now a report on congestion issues, and we have also been monitoring other measures implemented either by the NRAs or by public and private parties in order to alleviate pandemic effects on connectivity. So these reports come out. They are now down to a weekly schedule, and they combine both these types of monitoring. And I think I can just underscore, I think, what was mentioned by both Roberto and by Jeremy, that we see that the investments that were made prior to the current crisis have helped us immensely. We have been able to cope with the increased use that come from people work from home, schools being taught from home, and so on. It has been very robust, in fact, and almost no issues. So thank you very much to everyone in the sector for ensuring that we have been able to keep this up. Now, on the usage patterns, of course, there have been changes to the usage patterns. There is more usage, I think, reported daytime than in normal times, which is, of course, not so strange when you know that people are working from home and schooling from home. But what we see, and I can take the Swedish example there, which I know best, the peak use in normal times, pre-corona times, was always on Sunday evenings, weekend use, evening use. And despite having increased quite a bit, the daytime use is still way below the peak time that we see on normal use, and even more below the peaks that the networks are built to accommodate when special events happen, like a big download of a popular game or something like this, where a number of people use a lot of capacity at more or less the same time. So we see a lot of robustness, and I think this is generally the case throughout Europe. And let's keep the good work up and ensure that continues. Now, another new task that has come our way was mentioned also by Roberto. It's the work on the COVID-19 tracing apps, which is a little bit newer work for us. We haven't really found a routine around that yet. Essentially, the recommendation is directed to the e-health network, so not to the NRAs or to BEREC as such, but it does say that BEREC and a number of other expert bodies should assist the e-health network and the Commission with their tasks on the recommendation relating to the apps. And of course, BEREC is very keen to assist this work, this important work, in any which way we can. And we are speaking to those more directly involved. And what this help may consist of is, as I said, not really clear yet. One can perhaps guess that there might be net neutrality aspects to this work, ensuring that that these apps actually function despite the end of data caps or whatever it might be, so that we have a continuous functioning of the apps. Another issue that I've seen reported, which may be coming our way, I suppose, is with interoperability of tracing apps. That is to say that some of these apps are already in use, and they are, I suppose, on a more national scale so far than on a combined European scale, and that if we hopefully get our society opening up a little bit sometime in the not too distant future, we may want to see that these apps function also across borders inside the EU, and this may be work where the BEREC could perhaps assist, given the experience we have in regulation access and interoperability issues in telecommunication networks. Finally, I thought I would say something about spectrum. Those who know BEREC well know that we are not the spectrum management organization in Europe. It's generally RSPG, but we are very keenly following the development of spectrum allocation. You know that lots of spectrum is supposed to come out for use this year, and of course, situation that we have with increased use perhaps in different locations from where it usually is used. We see the use of getting those spectrum allocation processes going, and of course there is a risk that some of the planned awards may be negatively affected due to limitations imposed by lockdowns, travel restrictions, and other things that might impede the intended processes of these auctions. Having said that, I am proud to just say, coming back again to my Swedish situation here, that we are going ahead with our 3.5 and 2.3 gigahertz auction. We issued the invitation to take part a couple of weeks back, and the auction is going to take place late this autumn. So that's going ahead, and I hope that's going to be the case in most of the countries. And finally, I also wanted to react to this EMF and misinformation issue relating to COVID and 5G that has led to very useless and misguided destruction of stations and antennas a little bit here and there in Europe. And of course, that is something where we are trying to assist in whatever way we can with providing good information about that this is absolutely rubbish misinformation, and that we try to reach out to low levels, I think, as possible in our national markets, or something where BEREC and the NRA members can assist in spreading good information that can perhaps settle unrest or provide reasonable people with ways to influence those who may want to see this as an opportunity to raise trouble. Now, final word, looking for a future, what is the post COVID-19 situation? I think none of us know. That's the only thing which we can say. It's tempting to say that there is no going back. I think we will never have a pre-corona situation. For one, we have learned to do many things much better in this way that we're doing exactly now, and I think we're not going to lose those skills. I think we are going to be working much more digital in the future. What that means in terms of replacing physical or complementing physical, I think that's still to be developed. And of course, when will this happen is the million-dollar question, which everyone is asking all the time. And I think we will see the health authorities are obviously in charge. All the great people they're doing so much good work to keep our societies as healthy as they can. Our only comment on to my own staff, for example, when are we going to go back to the office, is that we are going to go back office exactly as we went from the office. That is to say, when the health authorities recommend us to do so, we will do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. I'll now give the floor to Lindsay from Ofcom, and I think I particularly hope Lindsay will be able to tell us a bit about the end user and consumer rights issues that have arisen. The floor is yours, Lindsay.
Thank you, Jeremy. Welcome to my home in the UK. Like colleagues in PTS, colleagues in Ofcom are almost all working from home at the moment, and that looks set to continue for the foreseeable future. As Jeremy has said, to pick up some different issues, I thought I would focus on consumer protection and what has happened in relation to that in the UK, both immediately but also where this might point for the future. In common with everybody else across Europe, the priority in the UK has all been about keeping people and businesses connected. But actually, at a very early stage, really within a couple of days of the lockdown, issues around consumer protection were already being asked about and the subject of comment in the media and elsewhere. And that really focused on two aspects. First, the risk that consumers would be disconnected during the lockdown period because they were unable to pay their bills. So issues around debt and disconnection. And secondly, the fear that if consumers lost their service because there was a problem with their broadband, that it might not be possible to fix those services because of the difficulties of lack of engineers or engineers not being able to get into people's homes. So it was a very early priority, both for the UK government and for us as a regulator. And actually, within really a fortnight, with great tribute to our telecoms companies, we'd reached agreement with them for certain measures on a voluntary basis, which meant that we were able to reassure consumers that they should not see themselves disconnected during this period, and also that if they were to lose their connection and it wasn't possible to fix it, and it was their only form of connectivity, then providers would be prepared to provide alternative forms, perhaps a mobile phone, for example, for consumers who were dependent on a landline. And those have been important measures. They are in place until the end of June, and clearly as lockdown continues, there are questions about whether that will need to be extended. I think that was only half the story. Of course, it would be fair to say that in the UK, we found that the consumer experience was quite hard hit, and telecoms companies had some real problems and some real struggles to face. That was particularly so because a number of our larger companies had big call centres based overseas in English-speaking countries. So, for example, in India, in the Philippines, and South Africa. And those countries typically imposed very harsh lockdowns, which meant that basically those call centres were taken almost entirely out of action, at least initially. And that meant that it was extremely difficult for consumers actually to be able to get in touch with telecoms companies, and the companies themselves had to respond very rapidly to work out how they could make sure that the most vulnerable consumers were able to get in touch, and also to develop alternative means of communication. Companies, particularly on the network side, were also faced with a loss of engineers from people isolating, and as I say, also a difficulty in gaining access to consumer premises as well, to people's homes. And that presented some interesting challenges to us as a regulator. And again, at a relatively early stage in the process, we concluded that meant that we would have to take some pragmatic actions alongside. So we took the view that the main priority for companies had to be to keep people connected, to protect their networks, and also to prioritise vulnerable consumers. And provided they did that and took operational decisions in line with that, we would then take a pragmatic approach to enforcing our rules. Perhaps most significantly, that meant that we signalled we would be pragmatic about end of contract and best tariff notifications that we had introduced under the new code, but introduced them early in February, in fact, the February just gone. And a number of companies did pause those because they simply weren't able to deal with the traffic that they drove to their call centres or to switching. We also suspended our automatic compensation scheme that we have in place for broadband and landline repairs for similar reasons. Those things are coming back online now, which is good news for consumers. But I guess I wanted to highlight that we'd had to take some pragmatic decisions as a regulator alongside the huge efforts and the really admirable efforts that the companies themselves have taken. Looking to the future then of consumer protection, I think there's one interesting thing that I wanted to put on the table. In the UK, and I think probably true in many places across Europe, the question of the affordability of communication services has never really been a very significant issue for us. Consumer pricing has always been very competitive, and when we have done surveys, we find that very, very small percentages of people say that they don't buy communication services because they can't afford them. Clearly, we're moving into a very different economic space, and that economic picture may last a very long time. We have some indications of that in the UK. The furlough scheme, a lot of people, I think non-native English speakers may be wondering what furlough means. The first thing to say is you're in good company, because until relatively recently, I don't think many English speakers knew what furlough meant either. But in the UK now, it refers to a scheme that the government has put in place to pay up to 80% of the wages of UK employees who presently cannot work for their companies, up to a financial limit, and 25% of UK workers are currently on that scheme. We also know that around 1 in 9 UK consumers has been forced to take a mortgage holiday, is unable to pay their mortgage during this period. So I think we can expect that affordability, and given the criticality of connectivity, both now and in the future, we can expect affordability to loom rather larger in our thinking from a consumer protection angle going forward. And also, I think it's interesting to note the social tariff provisions in the new code in relation to that, which allows NRAs to require broadband providers to give an affordable tariff to consumers in certain circumstances. So I think there's a set of issues that perhaps we haven't had to have forefront to our mind in consumer protection, which may become a lot more live in coming months and years. I think that's all I wanted to say in relation to consumer protection, and I know there are some fascinating speakers to come, so I will close. There are lots of interesting issues. As with others, we have been very much involved in the disinformation side, both in relation obviously to 5G and health, but also in our role as the broadcast regulator. But I think I will hopefully pick up some of those in questions to come. So I'll pause now and hand back to Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. That's very interesting perspectives on the consumer side from the UK. I'm now going to hand to Antonello to tell us about what the experience has been in Italy, and also to share some of his views about what the future might hold. Antonello.
Many thanks, Jeremy, and allow me just to join the other speakers in thanking the IIC for this very interesting opportunity to share views on how we are coping with the pandemic. I guess all of us have been committed 24/7 in the last weeks and months on the day-to-day contingencies, and I think it is very useful if we can take stock of what we have done so far, and also consider in the near future, in the longer term perspective, if there's any need to readjust the policy and regulatory objective. Well, as you say, I will focus my first intervention on what Italy, and in particular Agcom, has done in order to face the pandemic, and in particular its effect on the electronic communication and in a broader perspective, digital markets. As you know, unfortunately, Italy was the first EU country who had to face the outbreak of the pandemic. The lockdown dates back to the 8th of March. And on the 17th of March, the government issued a decree, the so-called Cura Italia, can we translate in English as taking care of Italy or curing Italy, filled with several provisions, you can imagine, but some of them directly targeted to provide support to several economic sectors. A specific article is devoted to electronic communication networks and services, but I'm mentioning the network because as all over in Europe, and I would say all over the world, the concern on the possibility to rely on a robust connection was the priority issue. And so the decree provided with specific obligation upon network player as a provider of a public utility service to ensure and improve the quality of the connectivity as much as they can, and provided with the power of to AGCOM to intervene, evaluate network provider proposal, and intervene also with the changes in the current regulation if need be. Right the day after, so on the 18th of March, AGCOM already took some measure in the wholesale sector, but I would just like to mention the fact that we opened also 4 permanent roundtables, one of them devoted to telecom issues, and the other 3 on other sectors according to AGCOM convention remit. I would also like to say a few words afterwards if there's any chance. The other technical roundtable were on broadcasting, on postal services, and a 4th one, which is very, very closely connected to what we are going to discuss today, on platforms and big data. But let me go back to telecom issues, just to share with you the headings of the areas of intervention in this last month. When it comes to the wholesale market, the wholesale services, I would say there were several interventions, mainly but not exclusively targeted to the SMP player team, and some specific measures on team were some targeted reduction on several wholesale services, and also on the one-off cost migration copper to fiber in order to improve the ability by alternative operator to use ultra broadband wholesale connection. On the other hand, it was reduced the time to market for new cabinets in order also to support the possibility to rely on team connectivity wholesale services. Other measures were taken on all other operators. Actually, it was a sort of discussion that came up from the permanent roundtable, and other operators committed to improve as much as they can the bandwidth capacity. And we also accepted a specific request proposal from Open Fiber, which is the wholesale-only operator, to reduce the one-off activation cost for fiber, for wholesale fiber services. An issue that we identified, that we detected still in the wholesale sector is the issue of maintenance. You can imagine that the lockdown measure created some problems in terms of delays, in terms of possibility, especially when it comes to maintenance at the customer premises. And AGCOM started a monitoring of these problems in order to provide suggestion and to discuss the possibility to improve the maintenance activity by the telecom players. Closely connected, I would just like to mention what we have detected during the monitoring exercise of network congestion that has been already mentioned by Dan. We also launched this activity, and we collected data on a twice per week basis and then conveyed the data to the BEREC comprehensive report. What we have detected comparing the lockdown period to the non-lockdown, so the second and the third week of February, is an increase, as you can imagine, of network usage, more in the fixed than in mobile, and more in voice than in data. However, no need for traffic management, no major issue of congestion have been detected, and actually we also experience a more balanced occupation of the network. So not just in the peak time, but a more balance all along the day. In the area of consumer protection, I would just like to mention that we have discussed with the operator many measures, such as the suspension or the postponement of the payment of the bill for consumers who were in trouble, who were especially in the areas which have been the most affected by the COVID. The operators agreed to increase their data package, either fixed and mobile, with additional capacity, and also system to simplify the refill of prepaid SIM had been introduced in order to have the possibility to refill them virtually instead of going up to the operator's premises. Finally, some general measures have been considered and have been introduced actually to lessen the financial administrative burden for operators which are already in trouble with the, let's say, the outcome and the impact of the pandemic, which is also implies less cash flow for them, although the service have been increased, the service are provided to private customers, small and medium enterprise, which are in trouble with their own cash flow. So this is becoming a problem also for a market player, especially the smaller one. Probably you should be aware that Agicom is fully financed by contribution by the market, and we have decided to suspend the payment up to June, and then let's see what happens, especially for the operators which turnover is below a certain threshold. And finally, also the administrative terms have been suspended. So any kind of processes, inquiries, or enforcement measures which request an administrative process have been suspended according to consequence of the pandemic, in order to allow operators to participate and to provide their views in this kind of processes. I will stop here for the telecom, but I would just like to provide two bits on other areas of our intervention, which are a little bit outside the traditional telecom borders, but still relevant for today's discussion. One is the issue already mentioned by Roberto Viola on tracing apps. Agicom is member of a national committee established by the Ministry of Digital Development. For the time being, we have been on the second road in the selection of the app, where the data protection body played the primary role, but we will be soon involved into the operation and providing advice into the operation of the system. And as we all know, actually has been already stressed by Dan, based on the recommendation and on the recent toolbox provided by the European Commission and the e-health network, we will probably play a role collectively also within BEREC. The second one is on disinformation. We already have established in 2018 a roundtable with the online platform dealing with disinformation according to our convergent remit. And since the pandemic outbreak, we also focused on disinformation on fake news. We publish on disinformation, sorry, on COVID, fake news on COVID. We published a periodical report. We have been publishing a periodical report where we, let's say, can check that disinformation are substantially diverted to COVID issues. And we also identified within this broader picture several cyber attacks and attacks to network integrity, which are somehow using phishing messages, just like fake World Health Organization or fake advertising on, let's say, magical cure or news on fake news, on news on COVID that may be used to introduce viruses in the system. So these are activities we have been running and we have been reporting. One of the, let's say, areas for disinformation that have been already detected is obviously the disinformation related to COVID and 5G. I will stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonello. And I'm now going to introduce our last speaker, Wilhelm Eichweiler from BEREC to give us a perspective from Germany. Thank you, Wilhelm.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. So I want to take the opportunity to speak a little bit about the decision taken in Germany and the lessons learned so far. Before addressing specific regulatory aspects such as net neutrality or specific management against the backdrop of the crisis, let me stress once again that it has been heartening to see how on EU and on national level stakeholders of the sector have responded quickly, efficiently to meet the challenges of the crisis. So I have prepared some just a few slides, and may I turn your attention, if you want, to the first slide. You might know that in Germany some social distancing, yes, the second, yeah, thank you. Some social distancing measures have taken place, such as the closure of schools, business and facilities were introduced, but we did not have complete curfews like in other countries. However, and as recommended by the government, the huge majority of people stayed at home as far as possible, and millions of employees started working remotely. This caused an increased demand of capacity, and even if we are now in a phase of slightly loosening the restrictions, the demand for capacity is still high. The increase of traffic for teleworking, online teaching, or entertainment purposes raised worries that this could result in network congestion. You have pointed that out before, requiring traffic management measures even beyond the net neutrality rules. BEREC is closely monitoring the situation and is in regular contact with all network operators in order to keep track of the development. But there has been no indication of the networks in Germany so far that they are overloaded. So to make it clear, the networks are currently stable. With regard to the risk of any congestion, BEREC has developed some guidance with regard to permissible traffic management in line with the European net neutrality regulation. And this guidance is dynamic. It might be adjusted to the ongoing situation and dialogue with the telecoms sector. As my colleagues have pointed out, the joint statement of the European Commission and BEREC that has been very helpful, and we learned from the practice that the net neutrality rules provide sufficient room to apply traffic management measures in the situation of temporary or exceptional existing network congestion, be it impending or already existing. And in this regard, we welcome the cooperation with content providers helping to put pressure on networks. Following the talks with the EU Commission as well as on national level, streaming providers such as Netflix or Facebook modified their video streaming offers. And these measures have been taken proactively across Europe to ease the strain on the networks while still providing high quality content. And let me turn your attention a little bit to spectrum management. Some people ask for spectrum measures facilitating access to spectrum resourcing during the crisis. Others ask to postpone important auctions. In Germany, all frequency bands harmonized in Europe for public mobile radio, except the 26 gigahertz range, are already available and can be used by mobile radio operators. Most recently, the frequencies at 3.6 gigahertz were allocated and can be used by mobile network operators. And for the last harmonized 26 gigahertz frequency band, the allocation procedure is in the final stages and will be published soon. This means that the necessary resources are available for increasement capacity in the mobile networks, and we do not see any need for the provision of other pan-European non-harmonized frequency bands or any short-term harmonization. And in regard of some specific regulatory measures, the German government and BNetzA have taken some other measures to mitigate pandemic effects. Until the end of June, operators must not terminate the contracts of end users in case of corona-related payment defaults. Furthermore, the connection must not be blocked either, and BNetzA has also agreed on a simplified verification system via video when selling prepaid mobile services. BNetzA has requested all providers and operators to postpone all measures which might have a negative effect on the availability of emergency calls. Thus, Deutsche Telekom has suspended the IP migration of emergency connections until the situation is stabilized. That means after the crisis. And the whole package of restriction issued by the German government do not apply for undertakings dealing with the maintaining of the functioning of network infrastructure. With regard to legal certainty as to whether the company is covered by the above-mentioned expectations, BNetzA listed the relevant companies of all sectors on our website. And now I want to turn your attention to the issue of the tracing apps. You could read a lot of that in German newspapers. Concerning the development of tracing apps in Germany, there are currently 3 initiatives rolled out in its development. There is the Robert Koch Institute, the Institution for Safeguarding Public Health, and this institute has launched a mobile app that depends on the voluntary donation of data by end users. It uses pseudo-anonymized health data for the purpose of symptom detection and recording the geographical spread. And in parallel, providers are sharing anonymized and aggregated location data with the Robert Koch Institute in order to monitor shifts and directions of mobility and check the extent of compliance of the population with the obligations imposed by the federal states. And last but not least, and this is the most important one, the German government is working on a tracing app using pseudonymized data in order to measure the distance between people using Bluetooth in order to enable warning them of coming into contact with infected persons. And this app developed by SAP and Deutsche Telekom will depend on voluntary data provision. As it is highly important to preserve data protection, the German Data Protection Authority is closely involved in safeguarding the data protection standards with regard to all the 3 initiatives. BNetzA has to play a role in this game when it comes to data protection rules according to the e-privacy directive. And the last issue is a very critical one. Please allow me some words finally on this disinformation campaign going on around Corona and the alleged dangers of 5G in view of electromagnetic effects. These fake news are detrimental to the deployment of 5G, and it is important to communicate accurate and fact-based information instead. Thus, BNetzA is part of a cooperation between the German ministries and all relevant authorities developing a communication initiative on 5G that will cover some aspects, including electromagnetic field aspects. So let me conclude on the last slide. Let me close by the following. The Corona pandemic poses a huge challenge to the global socio-economic system not only from a short-term perspective, but also from a long-term perspective. Digitalization can be considered as a driving force to counteract social isolation, to spread information, and to facilitate the functioning of the economic system. It is fundamental to improve the performance in areas where deficits or problems become obvious. But the experiences show that the crisis does not justify throwing overboard well-established regulatory principles. Rather, the opposite is true. By applying the regulatory framework, the objectives will be reached and the system remains stable. This is particularly true with regards to preserving the open internet provisions, as well as e-privacy and data protection rules, as we risk undermining the very basis of the whole system, as well as infringing fundamental rights if we change them in an ad hoc approach. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Wilhelm. We have quite a few questions, and I will apologize in advance that we won't have time to get to all of them. But I think there's one topic which has been asked by many people. So with apologies to the individual questions, I will try to combine and synthesize the question. But we've been asked this, I think, by Cisco, by Telecom Italia, by SES, by a journalist whose name is up on my chat list somewhere, France. A number of people have asked questions really about the digital divide and about investment. Kind of linked together. So the questions are really about what does the crisis tell us about what it seems to us that everybody has a right to broadband so they can participate in society even when they're working from home. But what does that actually mean in terms of the services that they need? And what does that mean for the sorts of infrastructure investment that will be required, and then possibly then for regulation? So as Wilhelm said, existing regulatory structures should not be abandoned, but is there a need for a change of emphasis? So I might start by asking Lindsay, because in the UK, Ofcom has recently defined, I think, a 10 megabits per second minimum universal broadband service. And I wonder if Lindsay could talk a little bit about how Ofcom's thinking and her thinking has changed about is that enough? Are there other attributes of broadband that are universal? And then I might after that come to Roberto and ask him about the regulatory response and the policy response. So we have the code, and with a lot of emphasis on VHCN. It has the provisions on affordable, adequate broadband. We have the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. We have the state aid rules. Is that all enough? Do we need more? But first, I'll ask Lindsay to talk about what the user requirements are from her perspective. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. If I may, I'll just say a few words on fibre investment, and then I will pick up your question about the broadband universal service obligation. I mean, in the UK, we currently have relatively low levels of full fibre rollout, although increasing all the time. And our priority as a regulator, in partnership with the UK government, has been very much to encourage that. And I think, we believe that actually the experience of the pandemic very much strengthens that case. I think, interestingly, what it has shown very much is that there are other aspects of broadband which are perhaps just as important as speed. In common with other countries, and we'll be publishing our own statistics later on this week on this, we've noticed that speed has actually held up pretty well for consumers throughout this period. The occasional issue, usually related to large games downloads, but generally pretty good. But actually, some of the things that have been as important have been issues around latency, reliability, and upload speed, as well as download speed, as we all become so much more reliant on video conferencing, for example. Now, all of those things seem to me to be still continue to support the case for full fibre, and indeed we were really encouraged to see our largest infrastructure builder, Openreach, with the BT board agreeing this week, deciding this week to invest to roll out full fibre to 20 million homes in the UK by the latter part of the 2020s, which suggests that there is some confidence there that the fibre case remains extremely strong and indeed has been bolstered. But I think there is an interesting reflection about the types and the attributes of broadband that have been shown to be important in this period, which go a little bit beyond just the question of speed, I think. Turning just to the broadband universal service obligation, yes, our 10 megabits solution USO, 1 megabit upload, I should say, was introduced on the 20th of March. So quite interesting timing. I think we locked down in the UK on the 23rd. So we are quite at quite early stages in that process. And the important for me to say that the terms of that USO, so the speed and other requirements in legislation by the UK, and our role is to implement them. So it will absolutely be a question for the UK government as to whether that specification remains adequate, and whether, in light of what we now understand and what we now know, that may need to be revisited for those parts of the country and who will perhaps still be a little while away from seeing the benefits of full fibre. So I certainly think that's a public policy question going forward. And just one final reflection, if I may. In the UK, stubbornly, around 13% of the population say they never use the internet. And that has really not changed at all for about the last 5 or 6 years. And well over half of those people, when asked why, say because it's not for people like them. And they see no reason why they would ever want to use the internet. One of the final things I think we're really in from a digital exclusion perspective is to see whether this pandemic shifts that figure for the first time in a number of years.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. I might ask Roberto then maybe to comment on the regulatory aspect. So I think we have, in Europe, 80% or 80+% NGA coverage. We have nearly 100% of basic broadband coverage, and we have a very much lower level of fibre coverage. So in the code, there was a lot of discussion about how do we raise the VHCN coverage percentage. But how do you think the priority is shifting towards, addressing the have-nots as much as the people who already have, and giving more to those that already have, or giving something to those that don't yet have, and how will that affect the way we implement or even legislative proposals from the Commission? Roberto.
Thank you, Jeremy. Well, first of all, I don't think we have to be that complacent about the situation of broadband in Europe. We have been coping, we said it, and we are all happy, but coping with crappy images, connection that goes in and out, this is not really structured way of teleworking or learning. So we must improve our communication infrastructure. We will be releasing the DESI this year, and rather depressing when it goes to the deployment of gigabit communication technologies in Europe. We are not there. We are not there. There's a clear delay. There's a gap in investment, which we fear will be even bigger with this crisis. So no surprise that we will insist very much that part of the recovery. It's also looking at our digital society. This was said very clearly by the leaders, by our president, after the discussion that took place in the European Council, that the recovery of Europe passes through digital and green transformation of our economy and society. In terms of regulatory remedies, I agree very much with Willie. I don't think we need special things. We have a brand new communication code that now needs to be translated in the European, from the European legislation to the national legislation, and it's very clear what, in terms of modernizing the concept of universal service and extending to broadband. I think, indeed, you have a point that we have an issue about those that can pay for broadband connection and those that are becoming many that have economic difficulties. And I'm glad to hear that many regulators took measures in this respect. So this is a very compelling issue that we need to solve in the near term. And in the longer term, indeed, I mean, the idea to step up the literacy of people in using the internet. I'm sure that what Lindsay kind of has as a feeling, it will be confirmed by numbers, that even the people that were reluctant to go on the internet now on the internet, but this does not mean that they know how to use technology. So all of this, it's a big reflection for our society, and I very much agree that this should be part of all our, let's say, political reflection when it comes to the well-thought recovery.
Thank you, Roberto. I'm going to turn to Dan now. There's been a couple of questions about BEREC strategy and work plan, and I wonder if you'd like to comment on those. So one question is, will the BEREC strategy, the forthcoming strategy, do you think it would be sensible to include something in it about regulation in the time of crisis, how regulation might change? And the other is quite a specific question. So observing that in the UK, the implementation of end user provisions of the code has been suspended or delayed by 12 months on the basis that the operators will find it very difficult to do the work to get themselves ready to comply, whilst at the same time dealing with the pandemic issues. And the question was whether BEREC would be issuing guidance on whether or not other NRAs should follow the same approach. So I think the two questions: the strategy, BEREC in regulation in the time of crisis, and will BEREC be advising NRAs to delay implementation of certain aspects of the code? Dan.
Thank you very much. I'll start, I think, with the second part of that, because that's in the current year. So we are trying to keep the work program going. Of course, that's our target. And with the help of meetings like this, digital meetings, I think we're so far quite successful in keeping the work plan as it is. And I think that will certainly be my focus. We have a code that we are tasked to implement and do many things on this year, and of course that will remain very much the focus for the remaining years. Having said that, we're learning so many things, both in our internal interactions. We will very soon have the first ever completely virtual contact network meeting this week, and then in a few weeks' time we will have the first ever complete virtual plenary meeting of BEREC. So we are developing new ways of working inside the group, and of course we're developing new ways of interacting with our stakeholders as well through digital. But I think the message is that we have the work plan we have until we have a new one. So I'm not very keen to start making changes to it. I think we can perfectly work with the deadlines that we have. Looking forward, of course, having this experience and learning all these new things, it would be crazy not to take that into account as we think of the strategy moving forward. We will have a new strategy for the next period that we will be adopting fairly soon. We're actually consulting on it with stakeholders still, I believe. And of course, in reviewing what will be the main task, the main goals for BEREC's next 4 to 5 years, we of course have to factor in the learning that we've had during this pandemic and the forecast that we can make what will be our tasks as we continue, because I think we will continue to feel the effects of this crisis for a long time to go. And if I may, just before handing back the word, Jeremy, on the previous question that was discussed, I completely agree with the expectation that there will be greater willingness to sign up for good broadband connection by consumers and by users. But I think a very important group that we would like to address and mention here is also local government, because we all know that sometimes there are many inhibitions in getting the permits needed to build out networks. I think if this pandemic has done anything to more remote location, local government, is to increase the awareness of the benefits to be connected and the disadvantages of not being well connected. So I hope we can see better responses to applications for masts to be built and for fiber to be dug down in the earth and things like this, where local government has a big influence.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's a very insightful point, that often it's not the telecoms regulators who have the biggest influence on whether or not networks get rolled out. I think that was one of the conclusions we had from the study that BEREC did last year on the dynamics of investment in very high capacity networks. Wilhelm, do you mind if I put a question to you, which is about net neutrality? So I think we've had quite a discussion about net neutrality, but there are a couple of points that Axon partners had asked. One was to observe the work the Commission did with the content providers to ask them voluntarily to reduce bit rates. And I think the question was, should there in fact be a formal power to ask content providers to reduce bit rates? And secondly, should ISPs in the time of a crisis have the ability to discriminate between traffic on the basis of relevance? So should they be allowed, for example, to prioritize traffic for work over traffic for leisure? So I know you said you thought existing frameworks would suffice, but what do you think of those two ideas?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the floor again. Regarding any role to ask content providers to reduce bit rates, we have no indication that formal powers are necessary. Content providers reduce the traffic volumes of their services on a voluntary basis, and the initiative has been a precautionary move aimed at conserving the spare capacity. It may well prove unnecessary, but it is a sensible precaution at a time when the medium-term impact of Corona on internet traffic management was uncertain. So it has been a kind of learning process. So I think we don't need no more formal powers on that. They are not necessary. On the second question, with regard to any discrimination of traffic, let me stress again, the net neutrality rules provide sufficient room to apply traffic management measures in the situation of a temporary or exceptional existing network congestion, be it impending or already existing. For example, it is permissible that data-intensive services in the data traffic category, such as streaming services, are slowed down if needed. It is also possible to reduce the data ratio of tariffs or individual tariffs, provided that this is done for all applications equally within the tariff. So in my regard, the network neutrality rules have been proven in this really complicated situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wilhelm. If I might then just pose one question to Antonello. Antonello, you talked about EDUCOM's role in combating fake news. And I think a number of speakers have talked about particularly the 5G fake news. We've had 5G linked with COVID, but for a much longer time, we've had rumors about 5G linked with cancer and other things, and unfounded accusations about safety not being properly established. Can I ask you, I suppose, again, two linked questions? One is, what do you think the role should be for any NRA in combating fake news about 5G? And secondly, do you think that the converged regulators, regulating both telecoms and content, do you think that's an idea whose value has been particularly demonstrated at this time, or do you think that that it hasn't really made that much difference that both telecoms and content have been under the same roof in Italy? Antonello.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I will start from the second one, answering the second one, but I'm sorry.
Antonello, I think you've turned off your camera.
I have to switch on the camera. Yes, I hope everything is fine now. So, answering first to the second question, I guess I will naturally be driven to answer also to the first one. So, yes, of course, we really believe that in these times of pandemic, but even before, our convergent nature helped a lot in addressing especially issues that are popping up now in the new digital environment. When it comes to fake news, as I was stressing in my first intervention, we already had an open floor for discussion with platforms on the basis of our own institutional remit in broadcasting. When we speak about online platform, this is also something which is beyond the traditional European broadcasting legislation, but still along the vein that has been, let's say, approached at European level with the European Code of Practice, basically, and nearly in parallel in 2018, we opened this floor for discussion on general issues. So it became natural and, let's say, timely to broaden the analysis to every kind of disinformation pattern stemming from the COVID. Obviously, I would just AGCOM is not the body responsible for assessing the, let's say, effects on the human health of the electromagnetic fields. But still, we can have a daily discussion between the people who are dealing with spectrum and the people who are dealing with disinformation in two different departments, and they may be aware which kind of information are based on scientific and sound evidence, which are basically urban legends. So this is fundamental. Second point I would just like to stress is the fact that, as I was telling you, the convergent attitude, in my view, has been somehow flagged by the pandemic, but it is something which is already shown as a value in the new digital environment. So in the end, as it is for the need for investment in reliable and ultra broadband connection, the pandemic somehow acted as a booster in this interaction between different fields. I think that this would be also helpful for the near future, and it may also, this experience may act as a booster also for the institute, the forthcoming discussion we are going to face in terms of institutional layout at European level. I really believe that each national institutional layout has its own specific reasons, and member states would definitely keep the right to define their own national distribution of competence. But still, as we have been already facing, and referring also to you as former chair, to Dan and Willy, even in the past, we more and more experience the need to discuss with our peer European platform in other areas. I'm thinking of the data protection group. I'm thinking of the group of European regulators in media. So I think that the next discussion we are going to face, probably within the digital service sector, in other fora, would be a good opportunity to start thinking together with the European institution on ways to better strengthen the interaction of different areas, still keeping our own national prerogatives and our national institutional layout. So this, I think, would be very, very helpful, and at least a good, let's say, opportunity that we can pick from the experience we are gaining in these challenging times.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonello. I think we're a little bit over the time, the advertised finish time, so I'm going to draw things to a close now. I would just say, I think by way of summary, that it's quite interesting, having been on a similar webinar organized by the IIC in the Americas, that we get a very similar picture of networks holding up well under the crisis, of a need to protect consumers who are suffering extreme issues in their own work and personal lives, and in the amount of money available to them, and also a kind of focus on the need to fill the digital divide. And I find it quite humbling that of all the debates we've had over the last few years about whether the European approach to regulation is superior or inferior to the American approach, where we have access regulation and we have net neutrality rules, and they have a different approach in America, that actually when things get really tested, it doesn't seem to matter which form of regulation you have in terms of the fundamental impact on the quality of the networks and investment and end users. So that regulation is clearly important in protecting the interests of promoting competition, protecting the interests of end users. But a lot of the debate that there has been about investment almost seems to be, the regulation is not anything like as important as a driver of investment as people would necessarily have had us believe. But I think it is, I think, a real tribute to the industry that there's been so little drama about telecommunications in the crisis, and there will, of course, I don't think anybody in any business will leave the crisis unchanged, and will leave the crisis without new insights about what we might do in the future. And so I think I must again thank all the panelists for sharing their insights. I think this is a conversation that will continue over the next months and years, and I look forward to being part of that. And once again, thanking the panelists and thanking everyone who was involved in the organisation of the event, and of course thanking the people who have been following the stream and posing questions without whom this would not have been worthwhile. So may I, as they say nowadays, wish you all a safe, wish you all that you stay safe and stay sane as time passes. Thank you very much.